So first, hi, I'm Kristi Winters, and I'm going to be organized or help organize the rest of the day, basically. So before we start on these concepts, I'd just like to tell you a little bit about what our intentions were with the second half of this course. The rest of the day will be about harmonization. And our idea was not that you would have to present all of this information in your classroom, but we want to take you through very basic concepts and then a case study, an example of how we're digitizing harmonization documentation here at BASIS, and then also a new product that we're going to be bringing online by September, shall we say, of this year. So just to let you know that these 4 lectures you're going to sit through now are all conceptually linked. And in order to help you identify the content in each one, the front page has the main thematic concepts that can be found in this lecture, in these lecture notes. And you can see that there are different, like metadata shows up in almost all of them, I think, because metadata is a very important concept for documenting harmonization. So just to say this is mix and match and everything is available for your use. The other thing too that I want to, before we start, just introduce you to the website that we used for this. We're going to be getting you the documentation. You realize that we have the electronic version of our references on the data sticks. We're going to be giving you at the end of the session, but it's not on this lecture slide, which we'll remedy when we upload this. But this information is a summary of what can be found on this website. And this website goes into really big, great detail. And we took, and by we I mean Yannick, took the major themes and pulled them out. So just for your knowledge, this website you can give to your students or you yourself can go to and read to get a lot more information on the concepts. But we're going to be building on what's inside here to highlight the things that we think are most important to your undergraduate or perhaps postgraduate students if they're going to be dealing with harmonizing data. So my goal here is just to kind of take you through the basics so you're familiar with the terms and get some background on it. We're going to go for 30 minutes and then we're going to go for lunch. So if you have any questions, you can always ask them at the end, but of course interrupt me if there's anything that's unclear as I'm going through. So what we're going to tell you in the next 30 minutes is what is harmonization, ways to harmonize data, variable harmonization processing, quality checks, documentation, and examples. I will also admit we come from a really biased position of survey data, and I heard there were psychologists in the room today. So apologies. we tend to cater more to sociologists than psychologists. However, the same principles apply. So I think it's a transferable concept and skill. Your students might not understand what is meant by harmonization, so to give a clear definition, you can tell them that standardization of inputs and outputs in usually comparative statistical analysis. And we do data harmonization because we need to compare like to like, and different surveys measure things possibly in different ways. So this comes back to validity and reliability. Does it measure what it says it's measuring? Does it measure the same phenomenon consistently over time? Are you comparing two things that are alike? This is really basic in terms of the scientific method, but when it comes to applying the concept of harmonization, it starts to become more practical rather than just a nice goal. And then the difficulties of enacting those principles also becomes more apparent. And obviously the more variables you have that are measured in slightly different ways, this compounds and extends how much variable harmonization you have to do. It's also important to get students to think about the process of harmonization when it takes place. Because if you have an opportunity to design a survey, which not many of us get the funding to do, but if we did have a chance to do a really big survey and we wanted to make sure that everything was, all of our variables could be used comparatively later on, we might take a lot of international education standards rather than maybe the national country standards, or include both and recode inside our data set. But it's basically the idea that I know in advance and I want to make my data comparable, reusable, and harmonizable to other data sets for inclusion. Most of us, though, in my experience, do the other side of it, which is output harmonization. I'm interested in looking at some phenomenon across Europe. I'm going to go get 3 or 4 different studies and pool variables that already exist. And so if you're doing a study like the European Value Survey, you might be using data that has been collected at a national level, but you know you want to compare it to a certain educational classification standard. So before you start your data set analysis, you take all of the individual countries and you harmonize them to an international code inside the data set so that you've got this, like before you put out your full comparative European Value Survey, so the harmonized variable is inside the data set already, and that was your plan all along. Or you might take ISSP data, World Value Survey data, Eurobarometer data, and pool them together, for instance, in order to look at some different attitudes over time. So you can have a plan before you go into the field or how you're going to do your study, but most of us do ex post. We're taking secondary data produced by other people and harmonizing it for our use. And that's just a way to think about it. Let's talk about what practical problems researchers face. Concepts are affected by language and by national context. And so when doing comparative analysis, this can make comparability, or the goal of comparability, more difficult. And in these cases, there isn't necessarily a right or wrong answer in terms of harmonization. For instance, like the concept of citizenship, but it might require you to be very explicit as to what your definition is for that study. So say one could look at attitudes towards citizenship in certain ways or whatever else. You can predetermine how you want to take that concept and define it for your use, rather than in your harmonization process. So you can also have differences in sampling design of the studies, which is problematic, but it's also the only data you have. So strengths and weaknesses. And then, of course, in terms of data comparing measures over time, Libby talked about data protection. Right? So data that might have been accessible 20 years ago might not be today. So how does that affect your ability to compare measures over time? Maybe it doesn't, but it's something to be aware of. In terms of planning a harmonization, from our experience working on harm stats, all researchers understand and have a goal to have harmonized data, to recode their variables, to have really good, clean data sets. But what we find is that when they actually have to approach the practical problem, it's a little bit overwhelming with question wording and label coding, and how do I organize it? Is it an Excel spreadsheet? Should I organize it in a Word document? Should I organize it in my statistical things? So it can kind of get a little bit out of hand. We hope that through this lecture, we'll give you a bit of guidance and structure on how to do it. But obviously, having a plan beforehand and a strategy is better than making decisions as you go. Okay. I'll just deal with that variable tomorrow. Think about what you want to do with it before you start to code, as opposed to in the moment recoding. Things to think about for people who, if you are going to be harmonizing data. And this is something that students can think about too on a really basic level. So let me give you an example from political science. We have a question that's often asked: do you identify with or feel closer to a political party? Yes, no, or I don't know. Now, there is a definitional case to be made that if someone says they don't know whether or not they're closer to a political party, they're really a no. They're not an I don't know. It's not missing data, it's actually a negative response, but they're just not choosing to say no. So looking at that, a student could think about, okay, is that when harmonizing a concept of political partisanship, should we include the don't knows? Or should we only include people who say no? There's not necessarily like a right or a wrong answer, but it's a conceptual definition. And this is how you can kind of get into the details of the differences in what is measured versus how it's measured. So it's a concept of identification, capturing the don't knows too. These are, again, I mean, it's a good, simple example that people can use to think about the conceptual level of data harmonization. And then there are the more practical ones here, including when you do recode it, demonstrate or documenting the language that you use so other people can see that you coded 9s into 0s, for instance, and they can replicate it. It's also important to think about the impact of weights or other design factors. If there's a question that's a yes-no question and some people are routed and other people aren't, how is that going to work with other surveys? Do they do that as well? So things to think about when approaching your data harmonization plan. And then when you do have a plan, you've kind of thought about the problems, you've come up with your solutions, you want to make sure you're systematic in the application of your standards as much as you can be. If you want to consult or read up on expert opinions, you can cite those in your literature, making a note of why you're making decisions based on a certain study that's done it before or a certain recommendation from an expert. You want to, ideally, if you can, gather feedback, but these are pretty idealized conditions. And of course, you want to make sure that you're implementing your external quality controls if you're working on a national study and you have the funding for that. Ideally, if you can find a software like Termstats that helps you develop your variable harmonization plan and documentation, it will also make it easier for other people to find your work, reuse it, replicate it, or cite it. We talked a little bit about the file level attributes, that there are just statistical challenges that face you if you're pooling multiple data sets, including things like survey weights. And as a data producer, if you have the luxury of creating your own data, you should think not only through your input harmonization plan, but obviously you might have some output harmonization needs on the other side as well. All of this is ultimately an aid of the scientific method when it comes to transparency in our research. And this is necessary because we want other people to be able to, as is written here, examine our evidence, parse our analysis, understand the processes by which our evidence and theories were chosen, and this will hopefully answer the questions, why should you trust us, and expend their time and research or time and effort to understand our existing research and what we've done. So given the importance of transparency to precise replication and also comparable statistical results, this lack of standards for documenting harmonization, we think, is a bit of an obstacle to the discipline going forward. And we're going to be dealing more with documentation of variable transformation and recoding in later lectures. So what are we documenting? Well, let's introduce some vocabulary. You guys probably have already heard the word metadata today, but just as a definition, it's information or data about your data. It can be any sort of descriptor that facilitates cataloging your data or to help people find your data. And any data that's submitted to an archive, like GASIS and other European archives, are going to be transformed into machine-readable metadata to make it easier to find. So this machine-readable metadata supports your documentation by adding information on the purpose, the origin, time, location, creators of the data, the terms of use of the data, access conditions. All of that is part of the documentation process when you submit to and are accepted by an archive. And for instance, you might be familiar with DDI or heard this phrase. It's one of the international standards for describing the data produced by surveys and other observational methods. And it's expressed in XML, and it has metadata specifications that are meant to capture every phase of the research data lifecycle from start to finish. So common things that you will find in a DDI metadata field, empty fields to fill out, the title of your study. There might be an alternative title of your study, names of the investigators who funded it, how to cite it in terms of your bibliography. I mean, you can read these, but there's quite a lot of data about your data that people might want to know. For instance, the universe of who was sampled. You might not want to use internet data, but you do, or you're fine with telephone data. knowing how the data was collected, what the universe of people were. This is all important for secondary users, certainly. Another thing you should put into your information is if you've updated your data set or extended it, you can version it so that you can cite which version you're using. If you use it in 15 years and you've changed a couple of things, you realize there was a mistake, you're using a 2.0 version, you can make sure you're referencing the correct version of your own document, your own data set, so that people make sure they're harmonizing the right one. And of course, we're going to show you later on how you can deposit and retrieve this information on something like what we're producing here, variable harmonization problem. Basically, you want to write your documentation such that anybody can come along and read it and understand how you got to where you got. So we talk about, have a goal of having documentation that's for the whole data life cycle. Ideally, you should be able to reverse all of the data conversions and decompose, variables that maybe are a scale into their individual parts. And we are offering tools, we'll tell you a little bit later on about, that will guide you to proper and transparent variable harmonization documentation. When documenting your harmonization process, please include the following information in your description of what you've done. What is the concept of the target variable? If it's education, if it's party ID, if it's social class, and also how it relates to your source variable. You want metadata information here on the source variable in the survey. You want to link explicitly connections between the source variables. Maybe there's 2 or 3 that you're harmonizing to a target. And of course, document whatever code that you use to transform it into a standardized variable. Other things to think about are the original question wording. Was it asked in multiple languages? So you might need to have 3 or 4 different languages, including the original English translation, in your documentation for transparency. You want, again, as we said in the DDI, information about the collection process, any other information that would be important to know, and any restricted use data agreements. For instance, you might have certain parts of your data that have employment data connected to it, but someone would have to go to a secure data archive in order to get that level of personal information, because in the secure data archive in the secure data center, you can work with sensitive data in that location. You can't take anything out of it though. So the data are maybe a little harder to get, but they are available, but people won't know that unless you specify that in your documentation. In terms of, again, if you're in documentation, online libraries would be a good place to store it. Obviously, with your data files, you can store your documentation. You want to guarantee as much transparency. And also, you can think about FAIR as a criteria for your documentation strategy. When Anna was talking about findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable, this is a way to think about organizing the information in your own variable harmonization, because those are the same principles an archive will be looking at. Another thing that you can do is provide, if you can get a permanent identifier for your documentation and publish it, like a place at the hub here. Most places don't have a space in your article or even a book to go through all of the details of how you've harmonized every variable. So what we're trying to do is get this information into digital form and also give researchers permanent identifiers so that they have a DOI, a digital object identifier. You know those from when you're doing your references, the hyperlinks at the back, last accessed in your references. And by moving this to a digital place, especially an archive, it means that people will be able to find and cite you, even if your article is behind a paywall. You could still get access to the work on the data set. And that's what's usually the thing that people really want to see. Even if they can read your abstract to get your general gist of it, but they might want to replicate what you've done, and this allows them the access to do that outside of your article footnotes. In terms of the quality check, things you should think about is, what is the meaning of the source variable? What does it mean to transform it into a harmonized target? We encourage you to provide information about the concepts that you're harmonizing to, definitions that are important for your theoretical test, any underlying assumptions. And when it comes to analyzing it, the website we referenced before offered what they call the 3 C's as a criteria for judging your harmonization work. Consistency, are you getting similar results from your multiple independent harmonization efforts? Completeness, are you able to capture all of the original data and preserve it into a harmonized structure? Comparability, and that's the degree to which harmonized outputs from different statistics can report real population differences or similarities. So is your harmonized stuff, pretty close to the original? Here's some more principles that you can look at, and there's a hyperlink here to the European Statistical System website, where they also talk about preparing, using these principles to guide your harmonization outputs. Okay. So this will come up again, especially metadata, the concept of metadata. We will provide you with a specific case study of detailed harmonization of variables and concepts and how we try to achieve these principles. Then in the afternoon, Paul is going to take you through how our software can actually import and combine metadata to provide documentation, and then in the very last part, I will and Martin will help introduce the hub, which is the first opportunity researchers will have to submit specifically their harmonization documentation to a repository for peer review and providing them with a permanent identifier so that we can start the process of actually archiving these documents in a centralized place where people can find them and download them immediately. Also, in your slides, there are more examples and more resources that you can look into, because obviously we've gone through this pretty quick. And with 5 minutes left, we're ready to move on to lunch. But before we move on to lunch, can I answer any questions? Actually, this is a teaching tool I was taught, I forgot it. It's to phrase things. Does anyone have any questions? Makes people feel like they have to say, yes, I have a question. So by saying, what are your questions? In the lecture, I'm assuming that there's information, so I'll just say, so what are your questions? Lunch, okay.